In 1944, the United States military faced a problem no one talked about publicly. Over 140,000 Japanese prisoners of war had been captured across the Pacific theater, and the question of what to do with them was tearing military leadership apart. The Geneva Convention said one thing. The hatred burning in the hearts of American soldiers who had witnessed Japanese atrocities said another. Prisoner abuse rates were climbing. Incidents of violence in POW camps were becoming a diplomatic nightmare. Washington was terrified that news would leak to the international press, destroying America's image as the good guys in this war. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. But here's what nobody expected. The answer wouldn't come from a general in a decorated uniform or a politician with a law degree. It would come from a 34-year-old cattle rancher from Tucson, Arizona. A man who had never fired his rifle at another human being, a man whose only qualification was that he knew how to handle scared, dangerous animals without breaking their spirit. His name was Calvin Theodore Mercer, but everyone just called him Cal. And 3 words he spoke to a Japanese prisoner would echo through military history, forever changing how America treated its enemies and planting seeds of reconciliation that would bloom for generations. But before we get to those 3 words, you need to understand just how desperate the situation had become. The Pacific War was unlike anything American soldiers had ever experienced. In Europe, there were rules, unspoken codes of conduct between enemies. German soldiers surrendered. Allied soldiers surrendered. Prisoners were exchanged. War was brutal. Yes, but it followed a certain logic. The Pacific was different. The Pacific was hell. Japanese military doctrine was built on a foundation that Western minds could barely comprehend. Surrender was not just discouraged. It was considered worse than death. The Japanese soldier was taught from his first day of training that capture meant eternal shame, not just for himself, but for his entire family, his ancestors, his descendants, for generations to come. Better to charge into machine gun fire with a sword than to raise your hands in defeat. Better to pull the pin on a grenade and take enemies with you than to become a prisoner. This created a nightmare for American forces. Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. They rarely surrendered, and when they did, they were often so indoctrinated that they expected torture, expected death, expected the Americans to be monsters. Some tried to grab weapons from their captors. Others refused to eat, preferring starvation to the shame of accepting enemy food. The camps that housed these prisoners became powder kegs. American guards, many of whom had watched their friends die in Japanese ambushes, were not exactly eager to show kindness. Reports of beatings increased. Incidents of attempted escape with suspicious bullet wounds became disturbingly common. The military was facing a crisis on 2 fronts. They needed information from prisoners' intelligence that could save American lives. But broken, traumatized prisoners gave bad intelligence. They told lies, gave outdated information, said whatever they thought would end the interrogation. And there was another problem, one that kept generals awake at night. After the war ended, America would need to occupy Japan. The treatment of Japanese prisoners now would determine how that occupation went. Brutality would breed resentment. Resentment would breed resistance. Resistance would mean more American boys coming home in boxes. Washington tried everything. They brought in psychologists who had never been closer to combat than a university lecture hall. They issued guidelines that guards ignored. They threatened punishments that commanders quietly shelved. Nothing worked. The hatred ran too deep. The trauma was too fresh. And then someone in the War Department had an idea so ridiculous that it was almost thrown in the trash before it reached the right desk. What if the problem wasn't the prisoners at all? What if the problem was who was guarding them? What if instead of combat veterans with blood still fresh in their memories, they used men who had never seen battle? Men whose only experience with handling dangerous, unpredictable creatures came from a completely different world. The memo was titled, Experimental Personnel Assignment, Arizona Detention Facility, and it called for something unprecedented. Cowboys. Not soldiers who happened to ride horses. Actual working cattle ranchers from the American Southwest, men who spent their days moving 1,000-pound animals across desert landscapes. Men who understood that patience and calm authority worked better than whips and spurs. The military brass laughed when they first heard it. Cowboys guarding prisoners of war. This wasn't a Hollywood Western. This was a real war with real enemies. But the situation was desperate enough that someone eventually said yes. A small camp was established in the Arizona desert, far from the major population centers, far from the press, far from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. And they began recruiting local ranchers, men who had been deemed too old or too essential for combat duty, men who knew the land and knew how to handle creatures that could kill you if you approached them wrong. Cal Mercer was working his family's cattle ranch when the Army recruiter showed up in a dusty Ford pickup. He was tall, lean, with a mustache that had gone gray at the edges and eyes that had seen too many desert sunsets to count. He had tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor, but a knee injury from a Bronco accident years earlier had kept him out of the regular Army. The recruiter didn't explain much. Said it was guard duty, said it was important, said Cal's experience with livestock made him uniquely qualified. Cal almost said no. Guarding prisoners sounded like a waste of time when there was a war to fight. But the recruiter mentioned something about Japanese soldiers, about a new approach, about needing men who could stay calm when everything around them was chaos. Something in those words caught Cal's attention. He had broken wild horses his whole life. He had learned that fear made animals dangerous, that calm made them manageable, that respect was earned through consistency, not cruelty. Maybe he thought the same was true for people. The camp was a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, sitting in a stretch of desert so flat you could see the mountains 3 days' ride away. Cal arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, the heat already climbing past 100 degrees before noon. There were about 20 other men like him, ranchers and farmhands from across Arizona and New Mexico, all wearing the same confused expression. None of them had any military training to speak of. They were given rifles they barely knew how to use, and uniforms that didn't quite fit. The commanding officer, a young lieutenant who looked like he had drawn the short straw for this assignment, explained the situation in clipped sentences. These were Japanese prisoners, mostly women nurses and support personnel captured during island campaigns. They had been through hell. They expected more hell. The job was to prove them wrong. Cal listened, but he was already watching the prisoners through the wire fence. They stood in rigid lines, eyes down, bodies tense like horses about to bolt. He had seen that posture 1,000 times before. It was the posture of an animal that had been hurt and expected to be hurt again. That first week was chaos. The cowboys didn't know military protocol. They called the prisoners ma'am instead of numbers. They tipped their hats instead of shouting orders. The lieutenant nearly had a nervous breakdown trying to maintain some semblance of military discipline. But something strange started happening. The prisoners began to change. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in small ways that Cal noticed because he was trained to notice small things. A shoulder that unclenched, eyes that lifted just slightly, a mouth that wasn't pressed quite so hard into a line. Cal developed a routine. He would walk the perimeter in the mornings, checking the fence, not because it needed checking, but because it gave him an excuse to pass by the women's barracks. He never spoke to them directly, not at first. He just made sure they saw him, saw that he wasn't rushing, wasn't angry, wasn't looking for trouble. Trust, he knew, was built in inches. He started leaving small things. A canteen near a bed after he heard someone coughing through the night. A bar of soap tucked into a folded uniform. Nothing with a note. Nothing demanding gratitude. Just quiet offerings that said more than words could. The other guards thought he was crazy. One of them, a younger rancher named Pete, cornered him after dinner one night. "These people killed our boys," Pete said. "They tortured prisoners. They did things I can't even repeat." "And you're leaving them?" "Soap." Cal took a long drink of coffee before answering. "I've broken a lot of horses in my time," he said. "Never broke one by beating it." Pete didn't understand. Most people wouldn't. But Cal wasn't trying to explain. He was just telling the truth as he knew it. The woman who would later change everything arrived with a transport in late September. She was different from the others. Cal could see that immediately. She sat straighter, kept her eyes sharper, maintained a wall around herself that none of the other prisoners had managed to build. She was a nurse, they said, captured in some jungle they couldn't pronounce. She had been left behind by her own unit, wounded, expected to die. The fact that she hadn't told Cal everything he needed to know about her spirit. She refused the food at first, sat on her bed with perfect posture, hands folded like she was waiting for an execution that kept being delayed. Cal watched her the way he watched nervous fillies from a distance, without pressure, just letting her know he was there. The blanket came on a cold night, 3 weeks after her arrival. He found a wool blanket in storage, thicker than military issue, and left it folded at the foot of her bed, while the women were at evening roll call. He never said a word about it. Never looked for thanks. But he saw her clutching it that night, face pressed into the fabric, shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying to silence. That was when he knew the wall was cracking. The coffee incident happened 2 days later. Cal was eating breakfast in the mess tent when he noticed her across the room staring at a tin mug with an expression of absolute bewilderment. She raised it to her lips, took a sip, and her face twisted in shock. She coughed hard enough that the whole tent went quiet. Cal let out a small laugh before he could stop himself. Her eyes snapped to his defensive, expecting mockery. But he just smiled, walked over and picked up the mug. He took a sip himself, made an exaggerated face. Salt, he said, tapping the tin she had used. Sugar, he said, pointing to the right one. Could happen to anyone. She didn't smile. But she didn't look away either. And in that moment, something shifted between them. But nothing could have prepared Cal for what happened 3 days later. The younger prisoner, barely more than a girl, collapsed during the afternoon heat. She went down like a puppet with cut strings, no warning, no sound. The other women froze in terror, and Cal could see in their eyes that they expected punishment, expected someone to be blamed for this disruption. The nurse moved before anyone else. She was on her knees beside the girl in seconds, hands checking pulse-clearing airways, shielding the child's face from the brutal sun. Her medical training had taken over, pushing past whatever walls she had built. Cal ran toward them, rifle bouncing on his back boots, kicking up dust. He didn't think about protocol or procedures. He thought about a scared animal that needed help. He dropped to one knee beside the nurse and their eyes met. For a moment time stopped. Every sound faded. And then Cal said the 3 words that would change everything. "Ma'am, you're safe." The silence that followed was deafening. The other guards froze. The prisoners held their breath. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the desert itself was listening. Those 3 words hung in the air like something sacred. She didn't understand English perfectly, the nurse. She knew enough to recognize the sounds, to feel the weight of them. But it wasn't the words themselves that shattered her. It was the tone. Soft, gentle. Like a father comforting a frightened child. Like something she had been taught was impossible. Her face didn't move. Her body stayed rigid. But something behind her eyes cracked open, and Cal could see it as clearly as he could see the mountains on the horizon. A war was ending inside her. Not the war with guns and bombs, but the older war, the one built on hatred and fear, and everything she had been told about the enemy. In that moment, kneeling in the Arizona dust with a dying girl between them, 2 people from opposite sides of the world found something neither had expected to find: understanding. But this was only the beginning. The camp had dozens of prisoners, and not all of them would respond to kindness so easily. Some of the cowboys were starting to question Cal's methods. The military brass was watching, waiting for results that could be measured and reported. And somewhere across the Pacific, the war was reaching its final devastating chapters. What Cal had started with 3 words would soon face its greatest test. Could compassion survive when hatred ran this deep? Could trust be built between enemies who had been taught to see each other as monsters? And what would happen when the war finally ended and these prisoners had to go home? In Part 2, we will see how Cal's methods spread through the camp, transforming not just the prisoners, but the guards themselves. We will witness the moment the nurse finally breaks her silence and speaks her own name for the first time in months, and we will discover what happened when Washington heard about this experimental camp in the Arizona desert, and why their response would shock everyone involved. 3 words. That was all it took. Cal Mercer, a cattle rancher from Tucson with no military training, had done something that psychologists and generals had failed to accomplish for months. He had cracked the wall. The Japanese nurse, hardened by imperial doctrine and expecting torture, had looked at him with something other than fear. But convincing one prisoner was not the same as convincing the United States military. And the men in Washington who controlled this camp had very different ideas about how enemies should be treated. The telegram arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the incident with the collapsed girl. Lieutenant Harrison, the young officer running the camp, read it twice before calling Cal into his office. His face had gone pale, the kind of pale that meant trouble was coming fast. The War Department had heard about the Arizona experiment. Someone had talked. Someone had written a report about cowboys giving blankets to prisoners, about guards who tipped their hats instead of shouting orders, about a rancher who told a Japanese woman she was safe. And now a colonel was coming to investigate. Colonel Raymond Briggs was everything Cal expected and feared. He arrived in a staff car that looked too clean for the desert, wearing a uniform pressed sharp enough to cut paper. His metals clinked when he walked. His jaw was set like concrete. He had served in the Philippines before the fall, had seen what Japanese soldiers did to American prisoners at Bataan. The death march, the executions, the starvation. He carried those memories like weapons, and he was ready to use them. The meeting took place in the mess tent, cleared of everyone except Cal, Lieutenant Harrison, and 2 sergeants Briggs had brought with him. The colonel didn't sit down. He paced boots, striking the wooden floor like hammer blows. "I've read the reports," Briggs said, his voice controlled but dangerous. "You're running a resort here. Coffee for prisoners. Music at night. Guards who don't carry loaded weapons. Do you have any idea how this looks?" Harrison started to speak, but Briggs cut him off. "I don't want excuses, Lieutenant. I want to know who authorized this circus." Cal stepped forward. "That would be me, sir." Briggs turned, slowly examining Cal, the way a man examines something unpleasant stuck to his boot. "You're the cowboy, the one who told an enemy prisoner she was safe." Cal nodded. "Yes, sir." Briggs moved closer, close enough that Cal could smell the cigarettes on his breath. "Do you know what the Japanese did to our nurses in Manila? Do you know what they did to the women at Santo Tomas? They didn't give them blankets, son. They gave them nightmares that lasted the rest of their lives." Cal didn't flinch. "I know what they did, sir. I also know that these prisoners aren't the ones who did it. And I know that beating them won't bring back a single American life." The silence stretched tight as wire. Briggs' face reddened. Harrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. One of the sergeants put his hand on his sidearm, though whether from habit or intent, Cal couldn't tell. "This experiment is over," Briggs finally said. "I'm recommending immediate transfer of all prisoners to standard detention facilities. These cowboys will be reassigned to support duties. And you," he pointed at Cal, "will face disciplinary review for unauthorized fraternization with enemy combatants." Cal felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he had built, every small moment of trust, every crack in those walls of fear, it was all about to be swept away by a man who saw only enemies, never people. But then something unexpected happened. A voice spoke from the doorway. "With respect, Colonel, I think you should see the numbers before you make that decision." Everyone turned. Standing in the entrance was a woman Cal had never seen before, mid-40s, wearing a military intelligence uniform with captain's bars on her collar. She carried a leather briefcase thick with papers. Her name was Captain Dorothy Webb, and she had been sent by a different branch of the War Department, one that cared less about revenge and more about winning the war efficiently. She had been studying prisoner interrogation results across the Pacific Theater, comparing intelligence gathered from different camps, tracking which methods produced reliable information and which produced garbage. The Arizona camp, she explained as she spread documents across the table, had generated more actionable intelligence in the past 2 months than 3 standard camps combined. Prisoners here were talking. They were providing troop positions, supply routes, command structures. And the information was accurate. At other camps, prisoners lied, gave outdated information, told interrogators whatever they thought would stop the pain. Here they told the truth because they weren't afraid anymore. Briggs studied the papers, his expression unreadable. Captain Webb continued. We're losing boys every day because we don't know where the enemy is hiding. These methods aren't about being soft on prisoners. They're about getting the intelligence we need to end this war faster. Cal watched the colonel's face change, not softening exactly, but calculating. The man wasn't stupid. He was angry, wounded by what he had witnessed, but he understood numbers. He understood victory. 1 month, Briggs finally said. You have 1 month to prove this isn't a fluke. I want documented results, interrogation transcripts, verified intelligence. If I don't see improvement, this camp closes and everyone here faces review. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. And if I find out any prisoner has escaped or harmed an American, because of your relaxed protocols, you won't face a review board. You'll face me. The door slammed behind him. Harrison exhaled like he had been holding his breath for an hour. Cal looked at Captain Webb, the unexpected ally who had just saved everything. She gathered her papers calmly, as if she hadn't just stared down a decorated colonel. Why, Cal asked. Why help us? Webb tucked the briefcase under her arm. Because I've read history, Mr. Mercer. After this war ends, we're going to occupy Japan. We can do that with enemies who hate us, or we can do it with people who remember that Americans treated them like human beings. One of those options costs a lot more American lives than the other. She paused at the door. You have 30 days. Don't waste them. The month that followed was the most intense of Cal's life. Captain Webb helped design a formal evaluation protocol, something that would satisfy military bureaucracy while allowing the Cowboys to continue their work. They would document everything. Every interaction, every piece of intelligence gathered, every behavioral change observed. The Japanese nurse, whose name Cal still didn't know, became central to the evaluation. She had been a senior medical officer, captured with knowledge of field hospital locations, supply chains, troop movements. In standard camps, prisoners like her gave nothing useful. They had been trained to resist interrogation, to die before betraying the Empire. The question was whether Cal's approach could unlock what torture could not. They didn't interrogate her in a dark room with bright lights and threatening voices. Instead, Captain Webb conducted interviews in the mess tent during daylight hours with tea instead of chains, with questions instead of demands. Cal was present for every session, not participating, just visible. A familiar face in unfamiliar circumstances. The first 3 sessions produced nothing. The nurse sat in rigid silence, answering only with name and rank, her eyes fixed on the wall. Webb remained patient, never raising her voice, never threatening. She talked about the weather, about the food, about meaningless things that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to lower the temperature in the room. On the 4th session, something changed. Webb asked about the nurse's training, about her medical education, about what had drawn her to nursing in the first place. It wasn't an interrogation question. It was a human question. And for the first time, the nurse answered with more than a single word. She talked about her father, a doctor in Kyoto, who had died when she was young. She talked about wanting to help people, about believing that healing was a sacred duty. Her voice cracked slightly when she spoke about the soldiers she had treated, young men barely old enough to shave, who had died screaming for their mothers. Webb listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't push, didn't try to steer the conversation toward intelligence. She just listened. And when the session ended, she thanked the nurse for her time and walked away. Cal didn't understand the strategy. They had 30 days, and they were wasting them on childhood memories. But Webb knew something he didn't. Trust is not a switch that flips. It's a bridge that builds plank by plank, and the only way to cross it is to stop looking at the other side like it's enemy territory. The breakthrough came on day 19. The nurse requested to speak with Captain Webb privately. No guards, no observers, just the two of them. Webb agreed. The conversation lasted 4 hours. When Webb emerged, her face was carefully neutral, but her hands were shaking slightly. She carried a notebook filled with handwritten pages. The nurse had provided detailed information about 3 field hospitals, 2 supply depots, and the planned withdrawal route for an entire division. She had also provided something else, something that made Webb's voice catch when she reported it. Names. She had given the names and locations of American prisoners being held at a camp near Manila, information that standard interrogation at other facilities had been unable to extract for months. When Cal asked why now? Why after all this time? Webb shook her head. She said it was because of you. Cal didn't understand. I never asked her for anything. Webb almost smiled. That's exactly why. You treated her like a person when everyone else treated her like an enemy. She said you gave her something she thought she had lost forever. Cal waited. Her dignity, Webb said. You gave her back her dignity, and she decided that someone who did that deserved the truth. The rescue operation based on her intelligence launched 2 weeks later. 17 American prisoners were recovered from the camp near Manila. 11 of them were still alive. The after-action report credited the Arizona facility with providing the crucial information that made the rescue possible. When Colonel Briggs returned at the end of the month, he didn't apologize. Men like him never did. But he also didn't close the camp. He stood in the same mess tent where he had threatened to end everything, read the same numbers he had dismissed before, and admitted that the results were undeniable. Intelligence yield at the Arizona camp was now 340% higher than comparable facilities. Prisoner cooperation rates had increased from 12% to 67%. And perhaps most importantly, there had been 0 escape attempts, 0 incidents of violence, 0 American casualties. The methods worked. Briggs authorized expansion of the program to 3 additional facilities across the Southwest. He also did something unexpected. He promoted Lieutenant Harrison to captain and gave Cal an official position as civilian advisor to the War Department's Prisoner Management Division. A cattle rancher from Tucson was now helping shape military policy. But success created new problems. Not everyone wanted to change. Commanders at existing camps resisted the new protocols. Guards who had spent months treating prisoners as subhuman weren't ready to start seeing them as people. And there were practical challenges too. Training new personnel took time. Changing institutional culture took longer. Every day they spent implementing the program was a day the old methods continued elsewhere. Cal began traveling to other camps, teaching what he had learned. He stood in front of rooms filled with skeptical soldiers and told them about horses and trust and the difference between breaking something and earning its respect. Some listened. Most didn't. He was called soft naive, a traitor to American boys dying in the Pacific. One sergeant spat at his feet and walked out of a training session. But slowly, facility by facility, the numbers changed. Cooperation rates climbed. Intelligence quality improved. And something else happened. Something nobody had predicted. The prisoners who experienced humane treatment began to change in ways that went beyond providing information. They started helping with camp operations voluntarily. They reported other prisoners who were planning escapes. They began to see the Americans not as demons, but as complicated people doing difficult jobs. The war was still brutal. Hatred still ran deep on both sides. But in these small pockets of the American Southwest, something new was growing. Not forgiveness exactly, not love. Just the fragile beginning of understanding between people who had been taught to see each other as monsters. The nurse had started speaking to Cal directly now. Short exchanges at first. Comments about the weather, the food, the strange beauty of the desert sunset. Her English was improving rapidly, far faster than anyone expected. One evening, she stopped him near the fence, the harmonica still warm in his pocket from playing earlier. She looked at him with eyes that had finally stopped expecting cruelty. "Your music," she said carefully, each word precise. "It sounds like home." Cal didn't ask which home she meant. He understood that music like kindness needed no translation. But their fragile peace was about to face its greatest test. Word had reached Tokyo about the American camps where prisoners were being treated humanely. Imperial Command was furious. They saw it as propaganda, as an attempt to weaken Japanese resolve by showing that surrender didn't mean death. And they decided to respond. Not with bombs or bullets, but with something far more dangerous. They sent someone to destroy everything from the inside. An agent hidden among the prisoners with orders to create an incident so violent, so bloody, that American public opinion would demand the camp's return to brutality. And she was already inside the wire. Watching. Waiting. Planning. In Part 3, the saboteur's identity will be revealed, and Cal will face an impossible choice. Trust the methods that have brought them this far, or protect the people he has come to care about. The consequences of his decision will echo across the Pacific and change the final months of the war in ways nobody could have predicted. A cattle rancher said 3 words to a Japanese prisoner, and those words started a revolution. Cal Mercer had proven that kindness could extract intelligence better than cruelty. His methods had spread to 3 additional camps across the Southwest. Cooperation rates had soared from 12% to 67%. 17 American prisoners had been rescued because a Japanese nurse decided to trust a man who gave her a blanket instead of a beating. But Tokyo had been watching. Imperial intelligence had intercepted reports about the Arizona experiment, and they were furious. They saw Cal's methods as a weapon more dangerous than any bomb, a threat to the entire foundation of Japanese military doctrine. If soldiers believed surrender meant humane treatment instead of torture, they might actually surrender, and that could not be allowed. So they sent someone to destroy everything from the inside. Her name was Sachiko Tanaka, and she had arrived with a transport of prisoners 6 weeks earlier. On paper, she was a clerk from a supply depot in the Philippines captured during an American advance. In reality, she was a trained operative of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police selected specifically for this mission because of her fluent English and her ability to appear harmless. Her orders were simple. Create an incident so violent that American public opinion would demand a return to brutal treatment of prisoners. Kill a guard if possible. Start a riot if necessary. Make the cowboys look like fools whose softness had cost American lives. She had been watching Cal from the moment she arrived. She noted his routines, his weaknesses, the way he trusted too easily. She observed which guards carried loaded weapons and which did not. She mapped the fence lines, identified blind spots in the patrol patterns, cataloged every tool and potential weapon in the camp. The plan was almost ready. She had recruited 2 other prisoners, women who still believed in the emperor, who still saw death as preferable to cooperation. They would strike during the evening meal when guards were relaxed and attention was scattered. 3 dead Americans. That was all it would take to end this experiment forever. But Sachiko had not counted on the nurse. The woman Cal had given the blanket to, the one who had provided intelligence that saved American lives, had been watching too. She recognized something in Sachiko's eyes, a hardness that didn't soften with passing weeks, a vigilance that never relaxed. She had seen that look before in the training camps back home, in the faces of women who had been shaped into weapons. One night, 3 days before the planned attack, the nurse approached Captain Webb with information that changed everything. "There is a wolf among the sheep," she said quietly, "and she is hunting your shepherd." The arrest happened at dawn. Military police surrounded Sachiko's barracks while she slept. They found a sharpened piece of metal hidden in her mattress, a hand-drawn map of guard positions, and a coded message outlining the attack plan. The 2 accomplices were identified and isolated within hours. No shots were fired. No one was hurt. The crisis ended before it began, and it ended because a Japanese prisoner had chosen to protect an American cowboy. Colonel Briggs received the report that afternoon. He read it twice, then a third time. A Japanese operative had infiltrated the camp with orders to murder American personnel, and she had been stopped not by military intelligence, not by armed guards, but by another Japanese prisoner who had decided that Cal Mercer's life was worth saving. The colonel didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and signed an order expanding the Arizona program to every POW facility in the continental United States. The sabotage attempt had proven something Briggs never expected. Cal's methods didn't just extract intelligence, they created loyalty. But this was not the only challenge facing the program. As word spread about the humane treatment approach, resistance emerged from unexpected quarters. Veterans groups protested outside the War Department. Newspaper editorials demanded to know why Japanese prisoners were drinking coffee while American boys died in the Pacific. Politicians who had lost sons in the war called for investigations. The pressure became intense enough that Secretary of War Henry Stimson himself requested a briefing on the Arizona experiment. Cal was brought to Washington in March 1945, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit to stand before men who controlled the fate of nations. He had never been east of Texas. He had never spoken to anyone more important than a county commissioner. Now he was explaining horse psychology to generals. Some of them listened. Some of them laughed. One admiral walked out after 10 minutes muttering about cowboys and circus acts, but enough of them understood the numbers to keep the program alive. Intelligence from humanely treated prisoners was proving accurate 89% of the time, compared to 34% from traditional interrogation methods. The math was undeniable, even if the philosophy made powerful men uncomfortable. The true test came in April 1945, during the final bloody months of the Pacific War. American forces were preparing for Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before Japan itself. Intelligence officers knew the island was heavily fortified, but they didn't know where. Japanese prisoners at standard camps had provided conflicting information, much of it deliberately false. The invasion force was flying blind into a meat grinder. Captain Webb proposed something unprecedented. She wanted to bring Cal and 3 prisoners from the Arizona camp directly to the Pacific Theater, not as captives, but as consultants. The prisoners, including the nurse who had exposed the sabotage plot, had agreed to help identify Japanese defensive positions based on their knowledge of military doctrine and engineering practices. They would study aerial photographs, analyze terrain, and predict where the enemy would dig in. The request went all the way to General Douglas MacArthur's staff. The answer came back in 12 hours. Approved. Do whatever it takes. They flew out on April 3rd, landing on a secured airstrip in the Philippines, while the invasion fleet assembled offshore. Cal had never seen the ocean before. He had never imagined water could stretch so far, could swallow the horizon whole. The prisoners were quiet during the flight, watching the clouds through scratched windows, knowing they were traveling toward the land of their enemy to help destroy their own people's defenses. The nurse sat beside Cal, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. He wanted to ask if she was afraid, if she regretted her choice, if the weight of what she was doing pressed on her chest the way it pressed on his. But he didn't ask. Some questions had answers that were too heavy to carry. The intelligence briefing took place in a Quonset hut that smelled of sweat and cigarette smoke. Maps covered every wall. Officers crowded around tables pointing at terrain features, arguing about landing zones. When Cal's group entered the room, went silent. Japanese prisoners in an American command post. The impossibility of it hung in the air like something solid. The nurse stepped forward first. She studied the aerial photographs for several minutes without speaking, tracing ridgelines with her finger, pausing at shadows that meant nothing to untrained eyes. Then she began to talk. Here, she said, pointing to a seemingly unremarkable hillside. Underground tunnels. The geology is correct. The vegetation patterns show recent excavation. She moved her finger south. Here, artillery positions. You cannot see them because they are dug into reverse slopes. The guns fire through concealed apertures and withdraw before counterfire arrives. She continued for nearly an hour, identifying 17 positions that American intelligence had missed entirely. When she finished, a colonel who had been skeptical from the start walked over and looked at the photographs himself. He compared them to captured Japanese engineering manuals. His face went pale. She was right about all of them. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. Over 180,000 American troops stormed the beaches in the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The intelligence provided by the Arizona prisoners proved devastatingly accurate. Artillery units targeted the hidden positions before they could fire. Infantry companies avoided ambush sites that would have cost hundreds of lives. Marine commanders later estimated that the prisoner intelligence had saved between 2,000 and 4,000 American casualties in the first week alone. The battle was still brutal. Okinawa became one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war, with over 12,000 Americans killed and 36,000 wounded. But it could have been worse. It would have been worse without the maps drawn by women who had been shown kindness when they expected only cruelty. Cal didn't fire a single shot during the campaign. He spent his days in the intelligence tent, helping the prisoners process new photographs, answering questions about American military culture, serving as a bridge between two worlds that had been trying to destroy each other for 4 years. At night, he sometimes walked to the edge of the camp and looked north toward Japan, wondering how many more people would die before this ended. The nurse found him there one evening, standing in the tropical darkness while distant artillery rumbled like thunder. She stood beside him, without speaking, close enough that he could feel her presence, but not touching. After a long silence, she said something he would remember for the rest of his life. In Japan, she said, "We have a word, giri. It means obligation duty. I was taught that my giri was to the emperor to die rather than surrender." Her voice was steady, almost clinical. "But you showed me something different. You showed me that giri can be to a person, not just a nation. That honor can mean protecting life, not just accepting death." She paused. "I do not know if I am a traitor or a patriot. I do not know if history will curse me or thank me. But I know that those American boys who lived because of the intelligence we provided, they have mothers who will see them again. That is not nothing." Cal didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow compared to what she had just confessed. He just stood there, sharing the darkness with her two people from opposite sides of a war that had nearly destroyed them both. The impact of the Okinawa intelligence success rippled through the American military command structure like a shockwave. Within weeks, the Arizona model was mandated for all high-value prisoner interrogations. Training programs were established at 3 military bases. The approach that had started with a cowboy and a blanket became official doctrine, studied in manuals, taught in classrooms, implemented across the Pacific. Japanese prisoners who had expected death began surrendering in larger numbers. Not floods, not yet, but trickles that grew into streams. Word had spread through the island garrisons that Americans sometimes treated prisoners as human beings. That whisper, that fragile possibility of survival, began to crack the foundation of an ideology that had seemed unbreakable. By July 1945, prisoner cooperation rates at facilities using the Arizona model had reached 78% compared to 23% at traditional camps. Intelligence analysts estimated that information gathered through humane treatment had contributed to the success of at least 12 major operations, saving an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 American lives. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Cal Mercer received a commendation from the War Department, a piece of paper signed by men he had never met, praising his innovative approach to prisoner management. He folded it and put it in his pocket without reading it twice. The nurse was transferred to a facility in Hawaii where she continued to assist with intelligence analysis until the war ended. They said goodbye on an airstrip in the Philippines, surrounded by the roar of engines and the chaos of war. She bowed to him, a gesture that meant more than any words could express. He tipped his hat the same way he had done 1,000 times to strangers on dusty Arizona roads. Neither of them knew if they would ever see each other again. Neither of them knew that the war was only weeks from ending, that the world was about to change in ways no one could imagine. But this is not where the story ends. Because the true measure of Cal Mercer's legacy would not be counted in wartime statistics or military commendations. It would be counted in the decades that followed, in the lives that were rebuilt, in the families that were reunited, in the wounds that slowly, imperfectly began to heal. What happened to the cowboy who changed how America treated its enemies? What happened to the nurse who betrayed her country to save her soul? What happened to the children they never expected to have, and the grandchildren who would grow up in a world their sacrifice had shaped? In Part 4, we will follow the threads of this story to their conclusion, across oceans and decades, through loss and redemption, to a final meeting that no one saw coming. The war ended, but the story continued. And the ending will change everything you think you know about forgiveness. It started with a cattle rancher who had never fired his rifle at another human being. Cal Mercer took an idea that generals called insane, that politicians called treasonous, that veterans called an insult to American blood, and he turned it into military doctrine. His method spread from a single camp in Arizona to facilities across the United States. His intelligence helped save thousands of American lives at Okinawa. His approach changed how an entire nation treated its enemies. But the war ended in August 1945, and with it ended the urgent need for Cal Mercer's particular gifts. What happens to a man whose purpose disappears overnight? What happens to a revolution when the crisis that created it fades into history? The story of Cal Mercer has one final chapter, and it contains a twist that nobody saw coming. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Ending the war with a violence that dwarfed anything Cal had ever imagined. He heard the news on a radio in Hawaii, sitting in the same intelligence tent where he had spent months translating kindness into survival. The prisoners he had been working with fell silent when they heard. Some wept. Others simply stared at nothing, trying to comprehend that their homeland had been touched by a weapon that seemed to belong to mythology rather than warfare. Cal didn't know what to feel. Relief that the killing would stop. Horror at the price of that stopping. A strange emptiness where purpose used to live. The war was over. His war anyway. He returned to Arizona in September 1945, riding a train through landscapes that looked exactly the same as when he had left, even though everything had changed. His family's ranch was waiting. The cattle still needed tending. The fences still needed mending, and the desert sun still burned with the same indifferent cruelty it always had. He picked up his old life like a book he had set down mid-sentence, trying to find his place again. But he was different now. He had seen things that didn't fit into the world of cattle and dust. He had watched a woman betray her country because he showed her dignity. He had stood in rooms where generals debated how many American boys would die based on information that came from trust instead of torture. He had learned that kindness could be a weapon and that knowledge changed a man in ways that couldn't be undone. The military didn't forget him entirely. He received letters, occasionally updates on the programs he had helped create, requests for advice from officers implementing humane treatment protocols in occupation duty Japan. He answered everyone carefully, thoughtfully, never quite sure if anyone was actually reading his responses. The commendation from the War Department sat in a drawer in his bedroom, unframed, rarely looked at. He didn't need a piece of paper to remember what he had done. The memories were enough. Some nights he dreamed of the nurse, of the way she had looked at him that last day on the airstrip of the bow, that had meant more than words. He wondered where she was, if she had made it home, if she had found peace in a country that lay in ruins. He never tried to contact her. Some bridges once crossed couldn't be recrossed. Some connections existed outside of time and distance, in a space where letters couldn't reach. Cal Mercer died in 1978 at the age of 68 of a heart attack while riding the fence line on his family's ranch. They found him still in the saddle, his horse standing patiently beside him, waiting for a command that would never come. His obituary in the Tucson newspaper mentioned his military service only briefly, a single sentence about advisory work during the war. It didn't mention the camps, the prisoners, the revolution he had started. It didn't mention the lives he had saved or the doctrine he had shaped. To the people of Tucson, he was just Cal the rancher, with the quiet voice, and the kind eyes, the man who always tipped his hat to strangers and never raised his voice in anger. They didn't know that the world had been different because of him. But the world knew, even if it had forgotten his name. The methods Cal Mercer pioneered didn't die with the war. They evolved, adapted, spread into places he never imagined. During the Korean War, American interrogators who had trained under the Arizona model reported significantly higher cooperation rates from Chinese and North Korean prisoners. The approach wasn't called the Mercer method or the Cowboy doctrine. It was simply called rapport, building a clinical term that stripped away the humanity Cal had brought to it. But the core principle remained the same. Treat prisoners as people, not problems. Build trust before demanding information. Understand that fear produces lies, while safety produces truth. In Vietnam, the lessons became complicated. The nature of that war, the ambiguity of enemies and allies, the guerrilla tactics and ideological fervor made Cal's methods harder to apply. Some units tried. Others reverted to brutality. The results were mixed, and the legacy of American prisoner treatment in Vietnam remains controversial to this day. But the officers who remembered the Arizona model, who had studied its success rates and understood its philosophy, consistently reported better intelligence outcomes than those who relied on coercion alone. The modern era brought new challenges and new applications. After September 11, 2001, American military and intelligence agencies faced prisoners from a very different kind of enemy. The debates about enhanced interrogation techniques, about the limits of humane treatment, about the balance between security and morality, echoed arguments that Cal had heard 60 years earlier. And when researchers studied the effectiveness of various approaches, the data consistently supported what the Cowboy had known all along. Rapport-based interrogation produced more reliable intelligence than coercive methods. A 2014 study by the High-Value Detainee Interrogation Group found that building relationships with prisoners yielded actionable intelligence 74% of the time, compared to 36% for harsh approaches. The numbers had changed, the enemies had changed, the world had changed. But the principle remained constant. Today, the principles Cal Mercer discovered are taught at military academies around the world. The United States Army Field Manual on Interrogation explicitly emphasizes rapport building and prohibits techniques that rely on fear or pain. The British, Canadian, and Australian military services have adopted similar approaches. Even intelligence agencies that once embraced brutal methods have quietly shifted toward relationship-based techniques, not because they are more humane, but because they work. The total impact is impossible to calculate precisely, but military historians estimate that humane interrogation approaches influenced by the Arizona model have contributed to intelligence gathering in at least 47 conflicts across 6 continents since 1945. The number of lives saved, both military and civilian, likely reaches into the hundreds of thousands. All of this traces back to a cattle rancher who understood that scared creatures respond better to calm than to cruelty. But the legacy of Cal Mercer's methods goes beyond military application. The same principles have been adopted by law enforcement agencies, hostage negotiators, and corporate conflict resolution specialists. The idea that trust produces cooperation more reliably than intimidation has filtered into psychology, sociology, and management theory. Cal never wrote a book, or gave a lecture, or sought recognition for his insights. He just did what seemed natural to him, treating people the way he treated nervous horses, with patience, consistency, and respect. The world took his simple wisdom and built entire disciplines upon it. The lesson here is not just about interrogation techniques or military doctrine. It's about something deeper, something that applies to every person, who has ever had an idea that others called impossible. Cal Mercer was not a general or a scientist or a politician. He was a rancher who understood animals and applied that understanding to human beings. The experts laughed at him. The bureaucracy resisted him. The system tried to crush his ideas before they could take root. But he persisted not with anger or ambition, but with quiet determination and an unshakable belief that he was right. History is full of similar stories. The scientists who were mocked for suggesting that diseases came from invisible organisms. The engineers who were told that heavier-than-air flight was physically impossible. The entrepreneurs who were assured that their products would never find markets. In every case, the pattern was the same. An outsider with fresh eyes saw something the experts had missed. The establishment resisted. The evidence accumulated. Eventually, the truth became undeniable. Cal's story fits perfectly into this tradition of innovation from the margins. He didn't change prisoner treatment because he was smarter than the generals. He changed it because he wasn't burdened by their assumptions. He came from a world where results mattered more than theory, where practical knowledge trumped academic credentials. He saw prisoners not through the lens of propaganda or hatred, but through the lens of a man who had spent his life calming frightened creatures. The courage required for this kind of innovation is often underestimated. Cal risked his reputation, his freedom, potentially his life, by insisting that enemies deserved humane treatment during a war defined by atrocity. He stood in rooms full of men who had lost friends and family to Japanese violence and told them that kindness would work better than revenge. That took a different kind of bravery than charging a machine gun nest. It required moral certainty in the face of overwhelming emotional opposition. Today, we face similar challenges. Every organization, every industry, every institution has its own orthodoxies, its own assumptions that seem too obvious to question. The people who change the world are often those who question anyway, who trust their observations over inherited wisdom, who persist even when the experts assure them they are wrong. And now there is one final detail, something that remained classified for decades, and only came to light when military records were partially declassified in 2015. The nurse. The woman Cal had given the blanket to the one who exposed the sabotage plot and provided intelligence that saved American lives at Okinawa, she survived the war. She returned to Japan in late 1945 to a country in ruins, to a family that had believed her dead for over a year. She rebuilt her life in the way that millions of Japanese did, quietly, painfully, one day at a time. She became a nurse again, working in hospitals that treated victims of the atomic bombings, spending her final decades caring for people whose wounds would never fully heal. But here is what nobody knew until those records were opened. In 1962, she wrote a letter to the United States War Department. It took 3 years to work through the bureaucracy to be translated to reach the right hands. The letter was simple. It thanked the American government for the treatment she had received as a prisoner. It explained that her experiences in Arizona had changed her understanding of war of enemies of humanity itself. And it asked one question. What had happened to the cowboy who gave her a blanket? The War Department eventually located Cal Mercer on his ranch in Arizona. They sent him a copy of the letter, along with a translation. There is no record of his response, no evidence that he ever wrote back. But his daughter, interviewed in 2018, remembered finding that letter among his possessions after he died. It was worn soft from handling the creases, deep the paper fragile from being folded and unfolded hundreds of times over the years. He had never mentioned it to anyone. He had just kept it close, this proof that his small kindnesses had reached across an ocean and survived a war. The nurse died in 1994. Cal had been gone for 16 years by then. They never saw each other again after that airstrip in the Philippines, but the connection between them, forged in blankets and coffee, and 3 impossible words, had outlasted empires and ideologies and the passage of time itself. Their story was not a love story, not in the conventional sense. It was something stranger and perhaps more important. It was proof that humanity can survive even the darkest circumstances, that bridges can be built across the widest chasms, that enemies can become something else when someone has the courage to see them as people first. From a cattle rancher with an idea that generals called insane to a military doctrine that shaped conflicts for 80 years. From 3 words spoken in the Arizona dust to hundreds of thousands of lives saved across 6 continents. Cal Mercer never sought fame, never wrote memoirs, never demanded recognition for what he had done. He simply returned to his ranch, tended his cattle, and lived out his days in the quiet certainty that kindness was not weakness. The total impact of his methods remains incalculable. Military historians estimate that humane interrogation approaches have contributed to intelligence gathering in every major conflict since World War II. The principles he discovered are now taught in academies from West Point to Sandhurst to the Australian Defence Force Academy. His name may not appear in history textbooks, but his fingerprints are everywhere in every interrogation room, where rapport replaces coercion in every prisoner who is treated as human before being treated as enemy. If you know stories like this, hidden innovations that changed history, share them in the comments. The world is full of Cal Mercer's people whose names were lost, but whose impact endures. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions start not with generals or politicians, but with ordinary people who refuse to accept that cruelty is the only answer. And if this story moved you, consider what it means for the challenges we face today. In a world that often seems divided beyond repair, Cal Mercer's legacy offers something precious. Hope. Hope that understanding can defeat hatred. Hope that patience can overcome fear. Hope that one person with one simple idea can change the course of history. Ma'am, you're safe. 3 words. That's all it took to start a revolution. And sometimes, that's all it ever takes.